This is an unofficial, fan-made audiobook. All original stories are owned by Wizards of the Coast. If you are enjoying these stories, please consider subscribing to my Patreon over at patreon.com/voxoraculum for some special patron-exclusive content. Thanks. On with the story.
The streets were crawling with kami tonight. The Lantern Festival was a favorite for many of Towashi's night-loving spirits. On any other day, Kaito might have appreciated the extra camouflage. Part of his job required the ability to move through the streets unseen, and hordes of kami were an ideal solution. But he was running out of time. If he didn't finish the job soon, he'd lose a payday to another reckoner. It hadn't taken Kaito long to find his target. Gamblers were notoriously bad at keeping secrets, and this one had a history of debt and soured friendships. But if Kaito moved too soon, he'd risk scaring him off. And on a night like this, with heavy crowds and an abundance of fireworks displays, there were 1,000 places for a stranger to hide. A group of children ran past Kaito with sparklers in their fists, shrieking with delight. He flinched at the sound. It had only been a year since the Emperor went missing. 12 months since Kaito chased the mysterious stranger out of Kyodai's temple. The rest of Kamigawa may have been carrying on as normal, but when Kaito saw the bright red festival lanterns floating through the sky, the skewers of syrup-soaked rice dumplings in every street stall, and the kami of exultant revelry blazing across the rooftops in all its twinkling glory, he didn't feel an ounce of joy. All he could think about was his friend. Kaito would save his celebrating for the day the Emperor came home. He stepped beneath the canopy of neon parasols that kept the street vendors sheltered, where a trio of electric kami squabbled near one of the faltering outdoor heaters. The smallest of the three spirits leapt up, and the floating metal orbs around its industrial-style body flashed with irritation. Kaito threw up a hand to shield his eyes from the bright light, blinking several times before the kami scattered across the street to find another source of energy. When his vision readjusted, he was almost certain he'd lost sight of his target entirely. And he probably would have, if it weren't for the man's garish coat. The edges glowed a fluorescent yellow, and the rest of it was patterned with glossy, holographic koi. It was a bold choice for a man who owed Satoru Umezawa money. But there was something about festivals that tricked people into letting their guard down. Soundlessly, Kaito approached the man dressed in yellow, watching as he perched himself on one of the thin, wooden chairs outside a curry stall. He leaned across the table, speaking in rushed, loose words to a woman with flowers smeared across her forehead and drops of curry splattered on her apron. The Hyozan reckoners wouldn't want witnesses. Kaito needed to be careful. He slipped between the approaching customers, moving as if he were no more than a wisp of smoke in the shadows. He walked behind the man without stopping, and in one fluid sweep of his hand, Kaito reached into the man's coat and retrieved his wallet. The man didn't feel a thing. Kaito made sure of it. Following the shifting crowd to the edge of the market, Kaito distanced himself from the mark. When he was sure he hadn't been followed, Kaito paused at the street corner, opened the wallet, and counted the translucent banknotes inside. Most people on Kamigawa were happier using credit chips attached to their wrists, but anyone with a penchant for gambling wouldn't be silly enough to use wearable tech. Those who frequented Towashi's card dens had a saying, "Only risk what you're willing to lose." To avoid the temptation of risking everything, gamblers preferred physical money over credit chips. Luckily for Kaito, he'd picked up a few new skills over the years, pickpocketing being one of them. He thumbed through the notes, counting a second time just to be sure, before removing a miniature tablet from his pocket. One day, he hoped he'd be able to afford hands-free tech like the retina lenses he'd seen some of the other reckoners wear, but for now, the outdated comm would have to do. The device scanned his eyes, and a blurry hologram materialized. Kaito waved a finger, scrolling through details of every active listing until a pixelated image of the gambler's face appeared. Below was the man's name, how much money he owed Satoru, and tip-offs as to where he might be hiding. Kaito typed a coded message into the device and hit send. The target's listing flashed from blue to red before vanishing. In the space it left behind was the word completed. Across Kamigawa, the Hyozan reckoners would receive the same alert. They'd know Kaito cleared another job, and that he'd be on his way to Satoru's den in the Undercity to collect the bounty. Kaito stuffed the device back in his pocket, the sound of festival drums and fireworks echoing behind him. It was true that he wasn't ready to celebrate, but that didn't mean he wasn't hungry. Kaito pulled a few of the extra notes from the gambler's wallet, walked up to the nearest stall, and bought the biggest dumpling skewer he could find. As he made his way to the train station, shoyu dripping from his hand, Kaito decided that even though working for Satoru hadn't been his first choice, being a reckoner had its perks. The Undercity was shadowed by looming skyscrapers and vibrant cherry trees that failed to mask the stench of the open sewers nearby. Kaito had been doing jobs for the Hyozan reckoners for nearly a year. He'd grown used to the worst parts of Towashi's underbelly. He'd even grown used to the people, and they were far worse than anything that came out of the sewer. Kaito held his wrist up to the panelled door, and a red light scanned the wearable keycard. Security was mild in comparison to the Imperial Palace, but no one with any sense would ever attempt to break into reckoner territory. A security system was merely a formality. The door slid open, and Kaito followed a metal staircase down to a wide lobby, where card tables littered the room and a neon counter lined the back wall. Reckoners were perched on chairs and standing in doorways, most of their faces partially hidden by masks elaborately decorated with teeth and sharp horns. Colourful tattoos were visible on their arms. Some of the underlings had only one or two, but the higher-ups had tattoos that spread from their wrists all the way to their shoulders. For most reckoners, their loyalty tattoo was their first. If they betrayed Satoru, the initiation mark would eat into their flesh, eventually leading to a slow and painful death. Kaito wasn't the youngest underling amongst them, but being on the cusp of 16 made him just young enough to avoid initiation. He tried not to think about how long that would last. It wasn't that Kaito intended to be disloyal. Satoru had given him a job, after all, not to mention a place to live and food to eat. It wasn't that Kaito intended to be disloyal. Satoru had given him a job, after all, not to mention a place to live and food to eat. If it weren't for the Hyozan, Kaito would have still been wandering Towashi, surviving off the few coins he'd managed to scrounge up from the gutters. And maybe a few more from the pockets of unsuspecting strangers. But Kaito hadn't joined the Hyozan reckoners for the money. The gang's extensive network gave them access to every scrap of criminal information that existed. If anyone was going to know about the man with the metal arm, it would be Satoru's spies. If it meant finding the Emperor's assailant, Kaito would suffer a loyalty tattoo and stay in the Undercity for as long as it took. It was a small price to pay to bring his friend home. A burly figure wearing sculpted insectile armor stood in Kaito's path, brows as thick as caterpillars. He huffed, breath sour and eyes bloodshot. "You stole my mark." Kaito eyed the man's katana, its edges glowing a merciless red. Most of the reckoner's weapons were laced with poisons and illegal enhancements. All Kaito had was a thin knife that was more suited to slicing fruit than it was to drawing blood, but the last time he'd gone to the armory, a knife was all he could afford. Kaito had never been one to shy away from confrontation, but he couldn't deny they were unevenly matched. So he fought back with his words and hoped it wouldn't cost him a broken nose. "If a name's on the list, it's fair game," Kaito bit back coolly. "Not my fault you were too slow to get there first." The reckoner whistled through his crooked teeth. The gambler was only tagged as a mark this morning. How did you manage to find him so quickly? It was a festival, Kaito remarked. People go where the food is. I'd say you got lucky, but you don't even have blood on your hands. He narrowed his eyes. If you are stalling for time, trying to keep the rest of us from him, just so you can score a bounty. At the suggestion, a few of the other reckoners glanced up from the nearby card table. One was a muscular woman with metal gloves trailing up her elbows, each finger pointed and needle-sharp. Kaito had seen her work before. One swipe of her hand would leave a special kind of poison that caused venomous flowers to blossom from a person's wounds. I know about the code, Kaito said, but he made sure the others could hear him too. I don't need to lie to get a payday, or rough up a target just to make myself feel important. He shrugged. The listing said he owed money. So, I got the money. You are cocky for an underling, and too soft-bellied for a reckoner. The man tilted his head accusingly. Mercy is for the Imperials. It wasn't mercy, Kaito snapped back. I just didn't see the point in wasting time making someone bleed. There are plenty of other jobs I could be doing. We aren't paid by the hour. No, the woman with the metal fingers chimed in, a hint of a tattoo appearing along her collarbone. But it sure is fun to make them beg. The others laughed in response, and the sound went straight through Kaito's core like an icy dagger. He knew if he wasn't careful, he might someday find the same kind of dagger in his back. A tall woman with jet black hair appeared, and the laughter ceased. Kaito felt the chills seep through his bones, filling him with a sense of emptiness. Wisps of black smoke circled around her like phantom serpents. Unlike those who channel kami magic through mutual respect, this woman took a different approach to channeling. She'd allowed Azumaki, the kami of treachery incarnate, to possess her, and more than once. She believed doing so gave her prophetic hallucinations and visions of what would come to be. All Kaito could see was the dying grey colour of her skin, and the way the black of her eyes spilled out into the whites, like the kami hadn't just borrowed a part of her. It had consumed her very soul. Satoru wishes to speak with you, she said in a hollow voice, sweeping a hand toward one of the back rooms. Kaito followed her without a word, happy to leave the others behind, but he felt his nerves jolt to life across his skin. It was rare for Satoru to summon anyone. When he did, the people who stepped into his office usually came out with one less finger or several missing teeth, if they came out alive at all. Kaito felt the weight of the stranger's wallet. Did Satoru know that he'd taken some of the money to buy dumpling skewers? Kaito had counted the money several times over. There was plenty to cover the mark's debt. What Kaito took was extra. It couldn't possibly be seen as stealing from Satoru, could it? The woman pushed the door open, and Kaito stepped clumsily inside, eyes growing wide when he saw Satoru sitting behind his desk, bright tattoos trailing all the way up to the bottom of his ears. His black hair was wound in a tight bun, and a harsh expression knotted his entire face. Metal armor was latched strategically across his chest and arms, but there were windowed panels across his shoulders and stomach that showed off his colorful markings. A gas mask hung from his neck, neon green with painted blue swirls, making it look like the jaws of a monster. Satoru didn't motion for Kaito to sit. He didn't say a word. He simply stared, in a way that made Kaito's knees falter. I can explain, Kaito said quickly. I knew I'd bring you a profit on top of the debt. I've been tailing the guy since the afternoon, so when I smelled the show you... Satoru held up a hand to interrupt, and Kaito snapped his mouth shut. When the leader of the Hyozan Reckoners still didn't speak, Kaito pulled the wallet out of his pocket and set it carefully on the table between them. Satoru's eyes dropped before gesturing to the nearby channeler. She took the wallet and moved away to count the contents. After a moment, she simply nodded. Satoru pressed his elbows against the table and clasped his hands together, leaning in. I'm impressed by how well you're able to tail your marks. This is the third time this week you've cleared a name from the list on the same day it went up. Kaito swallowed, clenching his fists as if he were protecting his fingers. However, Satoru said, while your efficiency is worthy of praise, I'm not sure you've grasped what it means to send a message. Kaito's throat burned. He needed this job. He needed to be somewhere he could help the Emperor. Couldn't afford to let Satoru doubt him. There are reckoners who could send a message, but they don't clear as many names off your list as I do. Kaito knew he was being too bold, but it was all he could do to mask the cracks in his voice. I'm the best underling you have. Yet you have no loyalty mark. Satoru motioned to Kaito's bare skin, and then to the large screen against the wall. Surveillance feeds from the lobby appeared in rectangles. He'd been watching them the whole time. It seems I'm not the only one who wonders whether you have the stomach for this job. I'm here because I want to be. Yes. Satoru paused. You lived in Eiganjo before you came to us. I have seen an Imperial samurai leave the palace for a different kind of life, and every now and then one of them winds up here. But they leave because they see a broken system. His eyes darkened. You don't strike me as someone who cares much about systems. The memory of his childhood made Kaito's cheeks burn. He still felt guilty, not about leaving the palace, but for leaving Aiko behind. Not that she would have followed him beyond the wall. Her heart belonged to the palace and everything it stood for. Kaito's heart didn't really belong to anything. At least, not anything that could easily be explained. Kaito stiffened. I ran away because I knew the things I wanted out of life weren't things I was going to find in Eiganjo. And what is it you want? Kaito shrugged. Money. A better sword. To find out what happened to the Emperor and bring her home. At that, Satoru chuckled, brow still furrowed. I have a job for you, he said finally. One that isn't on the list. A job? Kaito blinked with relief. Maybe he'd get to keep his fingers after all. Satoru leaned back in his chair. There's a moonfolk on Otawara, a futurist prodigy, as they're calling him, who is prototyping a way to connect tech and kami. His research would sell for a high price on the black market, and it's only a matter of time before Hyozan's rivals hear about it and get the same idea. He tilted his head, studying Kaito carefully before dipping his chin. I want you to bring me the schematics. The pay would be good. Black market dealings always were. But it would also be a way to prove his loyalty to Satoru, without having to send any messages. Kaito gave a curt nod. Consider it done. I'll send you the details through your comm. Satoru waved a hand. You can see yourself out. Kaito left the room, ignoring the way the channeler watched him with black, assessing eyes. And once he was out in the street, under the shadows of a high-rise, he pulled out his tablet just in time to see the private message flash up on his holoscreen. There was only a photo and a name. Tameshi. Otawara wasn't at all like the surface. So many of the buildings were covered in metal and glass, reflecting the plane like it was shining a spotlight on every sudden movement. There were surveillance drones everywhere, and enormous origami mechs that prowled the edges of the floating city. After the Emperor vanished, the Imperials blamed the Futurists for the attack. Kaito wondered if the Futurists' raised defenses were a response to the accusations, or if their security systems were less about protection and more about concealing whatever was going on in their labs. It wasn't a secret that the Futurists liked to push the boundaries of technology. But maybe they were past towing the line. Maybe they'd already leapt over it entirely. Kaito would be lying if he said the thought didn't pique his interest. When Kaito finally managed to track down information on Tameshi's whereabouts, he discovered the Moonfolk was no longer on Otawara at all. He'd moved his research to the Boseiju district, the Kami-filled forest, and home to the Order of Jukai. Tailing a mark and breaking into laboratories was one thing, but angering the Kami? The ones in Boseiju were there to get away from the rest of Towashi. They were barely tolerant of the Order of Jukai. It was part of the reason Iganjo trained so many Kami diplomats to try to keep the peace between the mortal and spirit realms. The forest would not be friendly territory, not without someone to mediate. So, he contacted the only person who could help him and pleaded his case. Kaito paced beneath the archway on the outskirts of Boseiju. Stone pillars carved into the shapes of ancient Kami were perched throughout the moss gardens, their mouths wide open with enough space to leave an offering. Some of them housed fruit, while others contained origami animals scribbled with messages for the spirits yet to enter the mortal realm. Behind the temple stood a wide merge gate, the colors around it shimmering with metallic hues. Most people knew not to get too close. No one knew exactly what would happen if a mortal tried to step through the void. But Kami did occasionally make their way through the gates, and while the Imperials had constructed them to keep the crossings safe, the Order of Jukai built the temples to make sure the Kami felt welcomed. They believed spirits were a sacred part of nature that should be revered. Kaito never saw the point in treating Kami like they were gods. There was something about seeing a lethargic Kami sunbathing in a heap of mud that made them less ethereal. The crunch of footsteps sounded nearby, and Kaito lifted his head to find his sister standing several feet away. His shoulders relaxed. "Aiko, you came." She'd cut her hair since the last time he'd seen her. It was chopped short and severe, and made her look older. The way her lips were pursed and her eyes narrowed, she appeared strangely fox-like. Like a human version of Lightpaws, Kaito thought, mouth curving slightly at the resemblance. Aiko crossed her arms. "Don't look so happy. If I'm going to help you, there will be rules." Kaito held up his hands innocently. "I wouldn't have assumed anything less." "First of all, I'm not here to steal anything. I'm here to protect the Kami from whomever this Tameshi is. Because if he's doing the things you say he is, connecting tech and Kami, then he's breaking Imperial law and threatening the balance of both realms. And in case your judgment is as poor as I remember, absolutely no weapons. We cannot make the Kami here feel threatened in any way." "Great speech," Kaito chirped. "But if I needed a battle buddy, I would have asked someone from the Undercity. You're here because I need an Imperial to guide me through the forest under the guise of diplomacy." "You know I'm not an official Kami diplomat yet, right?" Aiko pointed out. "I haven't completed my training." "The Order of Jukai don't need to know that. And with any luck, we won't even see them. You're just here to make sure the Kami don't attack us along the forest border." No, Aiko countered. I'm here to put a stop to your friend. He's a mark, not a friend. There was a moment of silence, and when Aiko spoke again, her voice softened. Why are you doing this, Kaito? If joining the Hyozan Reckoners is your way of getting back at Lightpaws for not believing you, then... It's not, Kaito interjected. Aiko's expression splintered. Then why are you working for criminals? I'm doing this for the Emperor, Kaito replied, voice stiff. I've already heard rumblings of a secret organization not aligned with the Futurists or the Reckoners. The palace wouldn't listen to me about the man with the metal arm, but I know what I saw. And if he shows himself in Kamigawa, the Reckoners will know about it. He shook his head. Satoru is already questioning my loyalty. If I don't get him what he wants, I'll be back to where I was when I left the palace, with no leads and no one willing to help. At that, Aiko said nothing. Kaito's jaw tensed. All I need is Tameshi's research. After I take the schematics to Satoru and secure my place with the Reckoners, you can tell the Imperials whatever you have to. Aiko stood with her thoughts for a while, the tension building mostly from her shoulders. Fine, she said at last. Kaito tried not to appear too grateful in case she changed her mind. He nodded toward the trees. We should go while there is still light. I'd prefer to avoid running into the kami of empty graves in the middle of the night. He smirked like it was a peace offering. Especially because your plan is to go in unarmed. Oh, I've met her. She's quite polite, Aiko noted, straightening the metal braces around her forearms. If I were you, I'd be more concerned with the kami of forgotten clearings. She's famously territorial. Kaito had the good sense not to laugh, even when Aiko's eyes sparkled with humor, and he followed his sister into the forest. Aiko stood in front of the Kadama of the West tree. It towered over her by nearly 30 feet, wide limbs covered in bark, and its mouth stretched with threads of golden sap. A dozen luminescent blossoms circled the kami's head, and cascades of smaller branches trailed down its shoulders like a crown of hair. Kaito drummed his fingers against his arms, watching the introduction from a distance. He didn't know exactly what his sister was saying, or how displeased the kami was to see trespassers so close to the border of Jukai Forest. But after a while, Kaito bowed low and returned to Kaito's side. She says we can pass through safely, as long as we don't go beyond the river, Aiko explained carefully. She cast a glance over her shoulder and lowered her voice. I had mentioned Tameshi. I thought it might complicate matters if they knew there was a threat in the forest. Kaito smirked. Lying to the kami? Would Lightpaws approve? Aiko scowled. Don't make me regret this. They walked for nearly an hour. Kaito's eyes searched the faraway trees for signs of Tameshi's new research grounds. Flattened earth, fresh tracks, metal where it shouldn't be. But if Tameshi was nearby, he'd done a thorough job of covering up his presence. Kaito sensed Aiko's stiffness beside him, and he turned to face her. Her chin jutted out, and her mouth was pressed into an impenetrable line. It was the same look she'd get as a child when she was worried about being reprimanded, usually because of Kaito's mistakes. She didn't like lying to the kami, but Kaito wondered if the possibility of disappointing Lightpaws was also weighing on her shoulders. He couldn't blame her if it was. He remembered the feeling all too well. The only difference was that Aiko wanted to make their mentor proud, whereas Kaito, he wanted Lightpaws to be proud of the person he already was, and not the samurai she hoped he'd become. The ground shuddered without warning, and Kaito leapt backward, dagger finding his grip before his eyes had even processed the threat. But it wasn't an attack, just a slow-moving rock kami burrowing itself deeper into the earth for shade. Kaito relaxed, but Aiko's hardened stare made his cheeks burn. I thought we agreed no weapons, she hissed. Kaito gave a sheepish shrug in response. I would barely call it a weapon. It's more of a survival tool. Depending on your perspective, you might even call it a small kitchen utensil. My perspective is that you pulled out a blade the first time you saw Kami move, Aiko replied tersely. She pinched the bridge of her nose. This is exactly what I was worried about. Kaito slid the dagger into his belt, no longer bothering to conceal it in his clothes. It's nothing. Nobody got hurt. Don't you understand how serious this is? If you threaten the Kami, you're not just putting us both in danger. You're putting everything I've worked toward in danger too. Kaito bristled. You didn't have to come. Yes, I did. No. Kaito took a step closer. You could have told the Imperials about Towashi. They would have sent samurai straight here, arrested him, and made sure his research was destroyed. You knew the risks, and you still chose to come. And I'm grateful for your help, but you can't just... I didn't come here to help you, Aiko confessed abruptly. Kaito flinched. She balled her fists. I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, but this isn't just about stopping Tomeshi's research. It's about proving what his research is. Kaito frowned. What are you talking about? I saw something that night too, Kaito. The night the Emperor disappeared. Kaito felt as if the entire forest had become a tidal wave. He locked his knees, eyes glued to his sister, and waited for her to explain. Aiko chewed the edge of her lip, trying to find the right words. When the alarm sounded, I tried to find you. I was halfway across the student gardens when I saw you running toward Kyodai's temple. And that's when I saw something on the roof. Kaito's heart pounded. Did you see the man? The one I chased? She shook her head. It wasn't a man, it was a light. It was glowing as bright as a star, and then it exploded. Everyone else was so busy looking toward the wall, but I was looking for you. The light, it transformed into an animal and vanished. When I found out the Emperor was missing, I knew they must have been connected somehow. That maybe the Futurists had found a way to weaponize Kami. Kaito scraped a hand through his hair, frustrated. I've told you 1,000 times. What happened had nothing to do with the Futurists. There was a man in the temple that night. A man who was in the very room where the Emperor was last seen. That's who's responsible for the Emperor's disappearance, not a glowing animal. She narrowed her eyes. You said Tomeshi's research involved merging Kami and technology. What if that's exactly what I saw on the roof? Kaito stared, face morphing into understanding. Lightpaws didn't believe you. Aiko blinked. She didn't take what you saw seriously, the same way she didn't believe me. Kaito recognized the sting in her eyes. That's why you came. To prove to her that you were right. You make it sound childish. Kaito snorted. It is childish. So what if she didn't take you seriously? She didn't believe me either. At least you've had Lightpaw's approval since we were children. Aiko's expression faltered, eyes turning glassy. Kaito looked away. You were always the better one of us. I never expected Lightpaws to see anything else. But I stood in the temple that night begging the council to listen to me, and not one of them would. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Maybe they didn't listen to you then. But the only difference between you and me is that one day, they will. I do believe what you saw, you know, she said quietly. You believe he was a futurist. Kaito lifted his eyes. And that's not what I saw. Aiko nodded. Maybe Tameshi's research will prove one of us right. She hesitated. You can still come home, you know. It isn't too late to continue your training. That isn't my life. Not anymore. But you? Kaito flashed an earnest grin. You'll be great at it. Aiko took his hand, squeezed, and turned back toward the path. Sometimes the unspoken words between them were the loudest of all. Beyond the next rock bed was a stone staircase that wrapped around a hill. Cascading from the crest was a small waterfall, trickling over the moss edges and pooling below. The stepped earth created uneven levels beneath the river, making the clearing echo with the sound of rushing water all the way through the heart of the forest. Kaito knew the best place to hide in Towashi was within the largest crowds. Maybe in Jukai Forest, it was near the loudest waterfalls. Aiko held out a hand to stop Kaito from moving. We can't go any further. I promised the Kadama of the West Tree. Kaito pointed ahead at the mist beyond the trees. If Tameshi is here, he'll be close to the river, where it's loud and he can hide his tracks. He glanced at Aiko. The only promise I made was to the Emperor. And I'm not leaving here without the research. Ignoring Aiko's objections, Kaito stepped carefully across the protruding stones in the stream, balancing with care. When he reached the muddy bank, he scrambled to catch his footing before grabbing a fistful of thick vegetation and hoisting himself up the rocky hill. He turned to see if his sister had made it across the river, but she was gone. He had no right to feel hurt. He'd broken most of her rules, and they both had so much to lose if something went wrong. But the bitterness of being abandoned pinched his heart. Maybe it's what Aiko felt when he'd left Aiganjo. He wondered if it made them even. With his sister gone, it would only be a matter of time before she reported back to the Imperials. Feelings didn't matter. Kaito needed to find Tameshi before someone else came looking for him. Ducking to escape a low branch, Kaito found a path between the hills that led to a clearing. He pressed a finger to his wrist, and his metal crane drone came to life, breaking into sharp fragments before fluttering into the air. Kaito touched his temple and sent the drone skyward, squinting at the distorted image that shuddered through his camera feed. He'd been caught up in more than a few scuffles during his time with the Reckoners, and his drone had paid the price. There was no point using the damaged tech to track anyone in Tawashi's busy crowd, but Kaito was only looking for one person in the forest. No matter how blurry the feed was better than nothing. The crane raced through the woodland, and Kaito followed behind, staying close to the river. When he spotted metal on his camera, he knew he was close. The rushing water in every direction masked the noise completely, though the makeshift laboratory was almost impossible to miss. Laid out across the side of a felled tree was a collection of odd machines, all connected with wires and warped light. Most of the research was made up of scraps of metal, including a large steel box perched at the far end. Kaito took one step forward. The box rattled in response. Not a box. A cage. There was something trapped inside. Kaito heard the snap of twigs over the cascading waterfalls, but by the time he turned, it was too late. Tameshi had the upper hand, and he used it to crack his fist against Kaito's cheek. Kaito stumbled, fingers folding quickly over his dagger, and pointed the blade at the moonfolk. Tameshi had pale lilac skin, and hair spun in a high knot. His lanky build and smooth face gave away his youth. He couldn't be more than a year or two older than Kaito. Tameshi lifted a brow, blue robes fluttering as he hovered in the air, and laughed.
I didn't realize the monks of Jukai were so primitive.
He tilted his head.
I have seen better knives for scaling fish.
I'm not with the order, Kaito replied, studying Tameshi's body language for a weakness.
That explains the undercity clothes. Reckoner, I presume?
He paused, calculating.
I knew word of my research would get out eventually. I'm just surprised the Imperials didn't get here first.
What can I say? Getting people to underestimate me is kind of my thing. Towashi nodded toward Kaito's sad excuse for the weapon.
You are welcome to come back when you're more prepared. I'd hate for you to spend the next 5 minutes embarrassing yourself.
Kaito cracked a smile. If I made it too easy on you, it wouldn't be any fun. Towashi shrugged.
Suit yourself.
He withdrew a small rod from his belt and pressed it tightly to the panel on his chest. In an instant, the rod expanded, reshaping like folds of origami, until it transformed into a metal staff with a serrated edge. Towashi twirled it several times in his hands. Okay, now you're just showing off, Kaito muttered, finding the edge in his voice. He had a feeling he'd need it. Towashi charged, sweeping his staff against Kaito's legs. Kaito leapt, steadied himself, and spun with his dagger wedged in his fist. Towashi cracked his staff down again, and Kaito rolled out of the way, slicing at the air. He couldn't reach Towashi, not with the staff blocking his every swing. He could barely reach his robes. But Kaito had trained with the best teachers on Kamigawa. Of all the things he learned, the most important was that if his opponent was stronger, then he needed to be faster. The next time Towashi swung, Kaito didn't hesitate. He jabbed his blade against the serrated edge of the staff with just enough force to keep it in place, then snatched the rod with his free hand and swung his leg up, striking Tameshi's head. The blow knocked Towashi to the side, but the moonfolk glided back up, hovering in the air and still holding tight to his own weapon. Kaito refused to release his hold on the staff and dug his heels into the earth. Towashi retaliated, dropping fast to the ground. He threw his elbow toward Kaito's chin, but Kaito didn't falter. He used his weight to spin around Towashi, keeping the staff in front of the moonfolk's chest, until he managed to pull the rod against his opponent's throat. Towashi was taller and stronger, but Kaito had never been one to back down from a fight. And Kaito couldn't lose this one. Not when he needed the Reckoners to help him find the man from the rooftop. Everything Kaito did was an effort to bring the Emperor home. She was Kaito's best friend, and she was worth every risk, no matter the odds. Kaito pulled hard, and Towashi choked against the metal stick, pushing back with all his might. Kaito pulled hard, and Towashi choked against the metal stick, pushing back with all his might. Kaito heard him gasp, but all he could see in his vision was a desperate, unyielding red. Aiko's voice snapped him from his frenzy. Kaito? What are you doing? Let him go! He flashed his eyes toward his sister, still holding tight to the staff. I thought you left. I had to leave an offering for the kami, because contrary to what you think, paying respect and following rules can actually make a difference. She took several steps closer, words edged with authority. Stop it before you squeeze the life out of him. Have you forgotten he still has information we need? Kaito gritted his teeth. He started it. I don't care, Aiko hissed. This is not how we handle diplomatic relations. Kaito huffed before releasing Towashi with a shove. He curved both his fists over the staff. Towashi bent over, coughing violently. When the air returned to his lungs, he eyed Aiko.
So,
he rasped, rubbing his throat.
They sent the Imperials after all.
Aiko folded her arms in response. Kaito searched the sky before pressing his temple to recall his drone. It only took a few seconds to appear, and when he held out his arm, the crane shifted like paper and reattached comfortably to his wrist. Tameshi's eyes widened in surprise.
Where did you get that?
It was a gift, Kaito said thinly. From someone I met a long time ago.
You know Katsumasa?
Towashi dropped his arms. The fire in his eyes receded, replaced by a strange recognition. How do you know that name? Kaito demanded. It had been years since he'd met the moonfolk in the Imperial Gardens, but he could still picture him. More than that, he still remembered the things Katsumasa spoke of. About the future, the technology, and how they'd made Kaito feel like there was so much more he wanted to know.
He was my mentor. The drone you have, it is a design we worked on together.
A spark of pride filled Tameshi's eyes.
It is what I've been building my research on.
Aiko scowled, eyes blazing with anger. Your experiments with Kami in tech, it's a violation of the very foundations of Kamigawa. Towashi frowned.
I am trying to protect Kami.
Is that why you have one of them in a cage? Aiko marched toward the display of equipment. There was no lock on the crate, but she yanked the door with such force that Kaito wondered if a lock would have stopped her at all. She stepped back, waiting for a Kami to appear. When the silver face of a metal tanuki peeked its head around the corner and released several beeps and a whistle. Kaito blinked. What is that? The robot leapt to the ground, limbs clicking like 1,000 pieces of metal were falling into place, and twisted its head toward Kaito. Its paneled eyes scanned him, and for a moment, Kaito was sure it was the robot's attempt at curiosity.
I told you,
Towashi huffed, straightening.
My research is to help Kami, and the rest of Kamigawa. We know our two realms are merging, and that one day they will exist as one. But we still know so little about what's beyond the merge gates, or how our kinds will be affected when the merge is complete. If we are going to truly understand the Kami, we need a safe way to study them, a way to preserve the Kami existing on Kamigawa. Technology doesn't have to just be for us. It can be for Kami, too.
His voice was impassioned, and maybe a little wild. But Kaito couldn't find anything evil in his motives. He turned to Aiko to see what she thought, and he realized she still hadn't moved. Her eyes remained pinned to the metal tanuki, lips parted slightly like she was stuck in a trance. This robot is almost identical to the animal I saw. She turned to Kaito. The one that appeared from a flash of light. Kaito frowned, turning to Towashi. My sister thinks this creation of yours is the reason the Emperor of Kamigawa vanished. Care to defend yourself?
What you are accusing me of is impossible. This creation didn't even exist until a few months ago.
Tomashi's shoulders fell.
But I'm familiar with the creature you speak of. I've been searching for it too.
Why? Kaito challenged. And what does it have to do with the Emperor?
The light you saw was a Kami being born. A very rare Kami, and the only one of its kind. It is the very embodiment of the relationship the Emperor shares with Kyodai and the spirit realm,
Towashi explained.
I have been chasing it across Kamigawa for some time, and looking for ways to protect it.
He motioned to the metal tanuki.
It's what I built this prototype for.
Aiko folded her arms. There are thousands of Kami all around us, and none of them have ever required a robot for protection.
A Kami that embodies a connection with the spirit realm could have a radical effect on the merge gates.
Tameshi said, and Kaito didn't miss the warning in his voice.
There are variables here we have not accounted for. So yes, I want to protect it. But I also want to study its relationship between the two realms.
He shrugged.
Creating a connection between Kami and machine would give it the armor it needs. Think of it like a protective mech suit. It would allow us to track the Kami and make sure it remains safe. And that we remain safe too.
That same research could allow someone to manipulate it, Aiko pointed out. If the Kami really can affect the merge gates, you'd essentially be giving the same power to whoever holds the controls. Kaito's stomach dropped. If Satoru knew the truth, he would never sell the schematics on the black market. He'd keep the Kami for himself. And if the spirit really did have the untapped power over the merge gates, it would make the Hyozan Reckoners the strongest cell in the city. Maybe even in all of Kamigawa. Nobody should have that much power. Before anyone could say another word, a noise echoed outside of the canyon. A sound Kaito knew all too well. A shout, a song, a whisper, like three voices layered on top of one another. The voice of Kyodai. It can't be. Kaito mouthed. He moved slowly across the grass, eyes scanning the distance for a flash of the great Kami. Kyodai never left the temple. If she were here, in Jukai Forest, did that mean the Emperor? Had the Emperor returned? Kaito didn't wait. The hope in his heart was too powerful, too desperate. Ignoring the warning shouts from Aiko and Tameshi, he raced after the sound. He fought branches and brambles, kicking up clumps of dirt and running until his chest burned. There were so many things he wanted to say to her again. But mostly he just wanted to see her face and know that she was okay. Kaito skidded to a halt at the foot of an enormous camphor tree, the branches twisting in spirals and the leaves glittering an emerald green. But Kyodai wasn't there, and neither was the Emperor. Instead, he saw the tanuki-shaped Kami, with glowing white eyes and translucent fur. And the Kami saw him.